Carmel Cipollone.
Mr Speaker, I just want to reiterate what my colleague Phil Twyford said earlier. We are supporting this bill, but it is a wasted opportunity to set decent minimum standards that would ensure all rental properties are warm and dry. And I really want to start with the Children's Commissioner's comments. And I really want to talk about what the Children's Commissioner said at the Select Committee. That member that just spoke is on that Select Committee. Myself and Phil Twyford are on that Select Committee. We heard what the Children's Commissioner had to say. When submitting on this bill, he mentioned that there are 42,000 hospital admissions and 15 children die a year due to cold, mouldy and damp houses. And he argued these standards are inadequate to resolve that. He said the government made a promise to New Zealand children: we will make your house healthy. 3 years on from that budget promise, this bill will do little for children living in cold, damp, mouldy housing. It is a wasted opportunity and a broken promise to our children. End quote. And I think, Mr Speaker, that side of the House should be ashamed of themselves to hear from the Children's Commissioner that is the case. And we hear them talk about children with respiratory problems. We hear them talk about their attempts to resolve them. But I don't know, Mr Speaker, whether or not they really understand the reality of the respiratory problems that our children are faced with. I don't know if they've been into an emergency ward in the middle of a winter's night, Mr Speaker. But some of us have, actually, Mr Speaker. And I have to say, some of us actually aren't living in poverty, aren't living in overcrowded houses, but we have children that we've had to take to the emergency ward in the middle of the night due to conditions like bronchiolitis. And, Mr Speaker, I'm one of those parents that's had to do that, and I have to say that the house I was living in previously was half a leaky home, had problems, and since moving into a house that has the adequate insulation that we need, the HRV system, the heat pump, everything else, all of a sudden that child's not sick anymore, Mr Speaker. But it's disheartening when not only you have to take your own child into the emergency ward at 2 o'clock in the morning because you get told by Warmline, actually 60 breaths per minute is too much. They've listened to your child, they say get in the car and take them to the hospital straight away. But when you get to that ward, and it's not just your child, it's a room full of, and I'm going to say this, predominantly Māori and Pacific children in that emergency ward at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter with respiratory problems, Mr Speaker. Not due to any reason, no blame on their parents at all, but because for many of them, the conditions that they're living in. And also, Mr Speaker, because for some reason our children seem to be slightly more susceptible to these respiratory problems, but made worse by the fact that so many of them are living in housing conditions that are inadequate, Mr Speaker, and that's what we're here to address today. And that's what the government should have been addressing, Mr Speaker. As many submitters told the committee, insulation without heating only does half the job. Insulating a cold, damp home will not stop it being cold and damp. But again, for so many of those members across the House, they don't even have any understanding of what that reality is like. In 2016, Mr Speaker, we believe on this side of the House, and many of the general public believe, that it is completely unacceptable that children are still dying in houses that are unfit to live in. And according to the Children's Commissioner, at least 15 children per year are dying because of the fact that they're living in inadequate housing conditions. And yet we have the Housing Minister, Nick Smith, earlier tonight saying that the cost of doing what Labor is attempting to do through Andrew Little's Healthy Homes Bill is too expensive. Well, actually, Minister Nick Smith, the National Party, the hospitalisation of 42,000 children a year in New Zealand due to cold, damp, mouldy homes is too expensive for this country. And the cost of 15 lives of children every year because of cold, damp, mouldy homes is too expensive, Nick Smith and the national government. So this is the wrong place to try and make cost savings, Nick Smith and the national government. We believed during the Select Committee process and to this day, now that we're debating it in the House again, that a standard for ventilation should be enforced, and that we should require an affordable, modern and fixed heating source. We also believe that the 3-year phase-in period is excessive, Mr Speaker. We need to contrast what the National Government are trying to do with what Andrew has proposed, which fortunately now will go through to Select Committee with the support of the parties in the House that have some common sense, which doesn't include ACT and the National Government. Andrew Little's Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill would provide that all new tenancies after a year would have to meet standards for 1, methods of heating, 2, methods of insulation, 3, indoor temperatures, 4, ventilation, 5, draft stopping, and 6, drainage. And all of these things are things that the National Government should be supporting. So when John O'Naylor is yelling out as if I'm saying something outrageous, he really needs to reflect on his own set of beliefs and principles and what he's willing to support. And he probably needs to reflect on the fact that by joining that party, he has sold himself out, Mr Speaker. The government's standards, by allowing exceptions for houses insulated to old standards, leaves thousands of rentals not properly insulated. We believe that this is unjustifiable and think that all rental properties should be required to meet the modern standards. So let's look at what the National Government are proposing. Insulation, they're proposing this. What is Andrew Little proposing? Andrew Little is proposing this. Now, if we look at this, let's just reflect for a little while. 42,000 children admitted into hospital because of cold, damp, mouldy homes every year. Is it worth the cost to just go with this? Or should we actually paying for this? 15 children a year are dying because they don't have adequate housing, and the National Government still want us to rely on this. They should be ashamed of themselves, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the biggest issue coming through our office in West Auckland is Working Income New Zealand and housing. Usually housing, because of the Housing New Zealand being situated in WINS, is the major thing. But we have people coming to us all the time with letters from their doctors, from their GPs, from people at the hospital, informing us, letting us know they must be moved because of the housing conditions that they are in. And Mr Speaker, even when we're successful at rehousing these people so that they're no longer in those unhealthy homes, we know that another family desperate for housing is going to take up that same house that they've just moved out of because their children are sick, Mr Speaker. And there is nothing we can do about it because of the demand for housing and the desperation that our people are experiencing. And that is shameful, Mr Speaker. I feel embarrassed as an MP that when we move this family out of that house because their children are getting sick and the hospital has provided them with a letter to say that that's the case, that another family is going into that house, because of the fact that we have this housing shortage that has not been addressed by the National Government at all. We go round and round in circles talking about everything in the housing area. Healthy homes, emergency housing, social housing, the cost of rentals, the fact that people cannot afford to buy in this housing market. And all of it's interrelated, but all of it the government has an opportunity to influence, but they choose not to, Mr Speaker, and it's shameful that they don't do anything to address it. Mr Speaker, as I said, we have so many examples. I could write them up and publish them of families that are in this situation. And I just want to talk about one before I end. And it was a woman called Val who contacted me to say they had just left the hospital to go back to their home after her daughter had been in hospital for over a week with respiratory problems. She wrote to me and she said, I know we're going to end up back in hospital because we're back at the same house and this house is making my daughter sick. When we got in touch with Val, straight away she said to us, I'm sorry, I'm back in the hospital. That visit that we gave to her, which was meant to be at home, ended up being in Waitakere Hospital to visit her for the second time that her daughter had been admitted into that same hospital for 2 weeks because of the unhealthy home that they were living in. Mr Speaker, we have no choice but to support this bill because it does something. It does something. But Mr Speaker, it is far from enough. And actually, what we need the government to do is to support Andrew Little's Healthy Home Bill, because that will actually make a dent.
I'm sorry
in the
to interrupt the member,
42,000 children
but
that are
her
going to
time has
hospital
expired.
every year for respiratory problems.
Mr. Speaker.